Hey, good evening, Valrico Church family. It's wonderful to be with you again on this, the final night of your Vacation Bible School. You have a Bible tonight. In my Bible, I've opened to the book of John, chapter 21. 21st division of John's Gospel is where I've been asked to speak tonight, and look forward to that study with you in just a minute. It's been wonderful to be with you for these 4 days. I appreciate very much the invitation of your shepherds to be with this good church again. I had anticipated, of course, being with you in your building, and we'll look forward to that at a future time. But have enjoyed, nonetheless, the opportunity to study the Bible with you remotely, and appreciate you being willing to study in this way as well. I want to say a special word of thanks to Kyle and Jackson for their efforts to make sure that the electronics, as we recorded at Temple Terrace and transferred everything to you, and to make sure that everything works well. I know that these two men do great work, and I appreciate them very, very much. Again, appreciate your shepherds and their good invitation. Appreciate the men who've helped with the electronics. Love your preacher. I think you know that I have great affection and regard for Shane, the tremendous gospel preacher that he is. He is an amazing blend of insight into the scripture and practical applications, and I just appreciate him so very, very much. And all of you, this is such a wonderful church. When I am asked around the nation about churches in Temple Terrace, I'm always very happy to talk about Valrico, that Valrico is a church that is a beacon of really great things happening among the people of God. And so I appreciate who you are. Glad we are neighbors, glad that we can study the Bible together this week, and glad we can conclude things tonight with an amazing story out of the 21st division of John's great gospel. You know, ladies and gentlemen, in spite of the fact that we're living through the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, this really is an exciting period for many of our congregations. I know it is for yours at Valrico. I know that after weeks away from your building, you're meeting back in your building now on the Lord's Day, and that's an exciting thing. I know that you have just recently moved into a new building, and I tell you, that is just an amazing accomplishment. It's a wonderful thing in the life of a congregation. It just brings so many good things in so many ways. You have wonderful leadership among your church family, and I know you're appreciative of them. You have so many good things. I know God continues to bring wonderful new families to you and to your church family, and what a blessing that is. Just so many good things that are happening among you. But you know, the question always is, how enthusiastic are we when the good news becomes the old news? I think that really is where our character is tested, is it not? In so many venues of life, enthusiasm is much easier to achieve than it is to maintain. You think about that. A new marriage, a new job, a new exercise regimen, a new school year, a new life in Christ. It's easy to be excited about all of those when they are fresh and new. But what do you do when the honeymoon is over, or the job has become tedious, or the muscles are sore, or the homework begins to pile up, or your baptism is years and years in the past? That really is where our character is tested, is it not? I think John 21, in the passage I've been asked to look at tonight, I think it provides insight as to how to maintain an intense faith after that initial rush of excitement is in the past. Do you have your Bible tonight? Let's read together. We're going to read from John 21, a fairly lengthy section, as we read from verse 1 down to verse 14. Okay, let's read together. John 21, verse 1 beginning. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way, he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we are going with you also. They went out, and immediately they got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? They answered him, no. And he said to them, cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And so they cast, and now they were not able to draw the net in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in a little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, and they dragged the net with the fish. And as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." And Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. Now this is the third time that Jesus showed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. That's an amazing narrative. It's a wonderful narrative, and what I really want to focus on today as we talk about Christ will supply, I want to talk about the fact, it seems to me, it just kind of leaps off the page in my mind, that these disciples have been through a series of ups and downs over and over again. And yet what Jesus wants to do to them is to bring some balance and perspective in their life. He will supply not only fish that day, although fish were important to these men, but he supplies other things as well. Let's talk about that just a bit. I want us to think about some of the phraseology, some of the terminology in the passage before we really get where we're going this morning or tonight. The text says that Jesus appeared again. Now, again is an interesting concept. Sometimes the word again expresses tedium. We are having the same meal again. We're singing the same songs again. We've got to listen to Shane preach again. So I understand all of that. Sometimes it expresses excitement. And so we're drinking Starbucks again. We're eating Bluebell ice cream again. Well, those express excitement to me. And in this passage, the appearance of Jesus is just more of a good thing. Now, Jesus has appeared to the disciples on at least two previous occasions. One on the evening of his resurrection, one a week later to confirm his resurrection to Thomas. And this, no doubt, was an extremely exciting time for them. But Jesus had also told them, Matthew 26 and verse 32, to wait for him in Galilee. After I am risen, he said, I will go before you into Galilee. And so they were to go there and they were to wait for him. So they do. They walk the 70 miles and some time elapses. We don't know exactly how much. And evidently they grow restless because they are in Galilee, but Jesus is not. And so the text says, beginning in verse 3, that Peter finally says, I'm going fishing. I'm going fishing. Now, there's some commentators who say, you know what? Peter at this point just, he gave up on Jesus and said, look, I'm going to go back to my old way of life. Now, I don't think that's what's going on here at all. Fishing was his trade. Peter was a married man, had children. We know that because he served as a shepherd, an elder. And so he has a family to support. And so he goes back to work. So don't think recreation here. Think occupation. But the challenge is, the text says, that that night they caught nothing. Well, that had to dampen their enthusiasm even more, because now not only was Jesus not there, but seemingly they've lost their touch with their profession. And so they have worked all night and yet not caught anything. But of course we know that this was God's doing, that God was preparing Peter and the other apostles for something extremely special. But let's be real honest. If we could just stop there for just a second. Let's be real honest about that. There are times when the Christian life is in fact frustrating. This was a frustrating time for them. Jesus was not there. They seemingly have lost their touch in their occupation. It was frustrating. And there are times when the Christian life is frustrating to us. Not every day of the Christian life matches the excitement of the day that you were baptized. Not every day, not every Sunday matches the excitement of the day that you open a brand spanking new church building for the very first time to worship. Not every day of your marriage is like a honeymoon. Not every day of school for your kids matches the excitement of the first day in August or the last day in May. I remember when my kids were both in school, when they were teenagers, that we'd sit around the dinner table and I would often say, well, how was school today? And they'd say, well, fine, it was fine. I'd say, well, what did you do there today? Really nothing. But what happened in school today? Nothing. And I remember thinking to myself, man, you were there for 7 hours and nothing happened? I need to go to school with you and see what's going on there. But that's kind of the way days are sometimes. I mean, not every day matches the excitement of the first day in August, of the last day in May. Not every day as a parent matches the excitement of the day that you were in a hospital and a new child into your family was born. You see, in almost every endeavor, there is a peak of enthusiasm followed by a valley of the mundane. And I think it's there that we are perhaps most vulnerable to temptation. That maybe the most vulnerable times we have are those plain, ordinary, vanilla days when we easily begin to let our guard down and temptation can find a foothold with us. And so they caught nothing. How frustrating that must have been. The text goes on and says as they listened to the person speaking to them on shore, that originally the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. I find that fascinating. There are post-resurrection stories where clearly Jesus appeared to people, but it doesn't seem they always recognized him. I've often wondered about that. Why is that? But it does seem to me that there are several post-resurrection stories where the people didn't always recognize that it was Jesus. I think about Mary Magdalene at the tomb of Jesus. And clearly, at least initially, she doesn't recognize who this is. Now, we say about that, well, she was crying, and so her eyes were full of tears, and so she couldn't really see clearly, or maybe it was still kind of dark, sun not fully up yet, and so maybe she just couldn't see clearly about that. Well, nobody's denying that, but you have to wonder if there wasn't something different about Jesus so that he wasn't immediately recognizable to them. Or we think about those two individuals on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. We typically say they were two men on the road to Emmaus, but we don't really know they were two men. We know one was. We know the name of one was Cleophas, but we don't know if the other was a man or not. It could have been his wife. We don't know. But there were two on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus, he joins himself to them. And they have a discussion about Messiah. But the text is very clear that they don't recognize Jesus. They don't recognize Jesus. But in Luke 24, beginning in verse 30, Jesus says, look, it's time for me to go. And they say, no, stay, it's getting late. Have dinner with us. And so they prepare a meal. And the text says that Jesus took some bread and he began to distribute it to his two dinner mates there. And as he handed it to them, it says that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. I've wondered about that. I've wondered about that. You remember what Jesus said to Thomas? He said, I want you to see the imprint in my hands and in my side. And so I've wondered when Jesus handed them the bread, if they didn't see the imprint and immediately then recognize this is Jesus. In John 21, in the passage that we're looking at, in John 21, and beginning in verse 12, he said to them, come and eat breakfast. And yet none of them dared ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was Jesus. That is, they had figured out it was Jesus. But why ask, who are you? Unless there was something different about his appearance. So the disciples didn't immediately recognize. It's interesting that Jesus asked them this question. Did you catch anything? Did you catch anything? Now, to fishermen who have fished all night and caught nothing, I think that would be a frustrating kind of question. Now, I say I think that would be because I'm not a fisherman. I don't like to fish. Actually, that's not exactly true. I hate to fish. I don't fish. The last time that I went fishing, I was 14 years old. I went with my dad and one of the men from the church where we were living at that point in time. And I remember thinking during the course of that day, you know what, Lord, if you'll just let this day end, I promise you, I will never put myself through this kind of agony again. And I've kept my promise. I've kept my promise. Last time I went fishing, I was 14 years old. Hours and hours and hours of catching nothing. It is extraordinarily frustrating. And so Jesus says to them, have you caught anything? Have you caught anything? Did you notice their answer? No. No explanation, nothing else, just No, we haven't. Every time I read this story, I'm reminded when Vicki and I lived in Plainfield, Indiana, when I was preaching there. Plainfield is a little suburb outside of Indianapolis. The winters up there can just be brutal. And I remember we had gone over one night with a group of friends to one of the young couple's house. And we were a young couple at that time. Our kids were small. And we got ready to leave and went out to the car, and I had locked the keys in the car. And it was my fault. I had locked the keys in the car. The wind chill that night was 20 degrees below zero. 20 below zero. And so I'm out there with a coat hanger. You know, Vicki and the kids, we get them all back in the house. And I'm out there with the coat hanger, and I'm trying to fish around and get in there and pull that door lock up. And after about 20 minutes, I remember Vicki stuck her head out the door, and she said, "Have you got it open yet?" And I thought to myself, yeah, I got it open 10 minutes ago. I'm just out here enjoying the night air. No, I don't have it open yet. Have you caught any fish? No, we haven't. How frustrating that must have been. And so Jesus says, well, maybe throw those nets over on the right side of the boat. Give that a try. I think that might work. You know, you might have expected the apostles to explode right there. I mean, after all, they were professional fishermen. They had plied these waters, hundreds of times, no doubt? And now a stranger is going to tell them how to do their job. But it's important. Maybe one of the things to learn right there is that there are going to be times when God is going to ask us to do something. God's going to tell us to obey him in a matter when it really makes no sense to us. Or it may be the exact opposite of what we want to do. I'm sure that made no sense to them after they had fished all night. I'm sure that's the last thing they wanted to do. They must have been exhausted. They wanted to get shore and just, leave this night behind them. And there are going to be times that God's going to ask us to do things that may not make sense to us and may be antithetical to exactly what we would want to do. I think about things like this. Somebody is unkind to us. Somebody's unfair to us. I think one of the most difficult commands, if not the most difficult command that God ever gave, is Matthew 5 and beginning in verse 44. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Has God ever asked us to do anything more difficult than that? That's one of those, put your nets on the right side of the boat. May not make sense to you. May not be what you want it to do. But from God's perspective, this is what needs to be done. I think about that with single adults and morality. And for single adults, God says, marriage is to be held in honor by all, and the bed undefiled. And American culture scoffs at that, ridicules that, says it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. And yet God says, this is a cast your net on the right side of the boat kind of issue. You've got to trust me here, that this is for the best. I think there are going to be a lot of those times, ladies and gentlemen, when God's going to ask us to do things, tell us to do things. And the issue is our obedience and our loyalty, our faithfulness to him. Now, in this case, they were rewarded. They were not able to haul the net in because of the great number of fish. From that, they draw the logical conclusion that this is the Lord. This is the Lord. John, in essence, says to Peter, hey, we've been here before. Remember Luke 5? Remember Luke 5 by the same Sea of Galilee? And we had this multiplication of catching more fish than we could hardly bring to shore. And so he just accurately concludes, this must be the Lord. Now Peter, he jumps in and he begins swimming to shore. I'm not sure why he did that, although it does seem to be somewhat in keeping with the character of his excitability. But look at verse 8 and 9 with me. These verses will not be on the screen. Verse 8, the other disciples came in the little boat. They were not far away from the land, about 200 cubits, and they dragged the net with the fish. And as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Now, that's always raised the interesting question, where did Jesus get his fish? Did he go fishing earlier in the morning? Or was this a supernatural event that he caused to happen? Now, I don't know. Maybe when the Lord does something that to him is natural, it's supernatural to us. I don't know. But I do know the text goes on and says that when they brought the fish to land, there were 153 of them. There were 153 fish. That's interesting. Now, the theme is that Christ will supply. And he supplies, in our first lesson, we learn from the wedding feast in Cana, in abundance. And he certainly does here. 153 fish. Now, theologians have had a field day with that. Theologians have tried to look into that and find some mystical and magical hidden meaning. 153. What on earth could that be referring to? And so there have been all kinds of things said about that. Cyril of Alexandria said, 100 equals 100-fold, the fullness of the Gentiles. 50 equals the number of the remnant of Israel. 3 is the number of the Trinity. And so you add them together and you get 153. Well, maybe. Augustine said that 10 represents the 10 commandments. 7 is the perfect number of grace. 10 plus 7 equals 17. You add all the numbers between 1 and 17, and they equal 153. Well, and they do. I took my calculator and I added them up. That's exactly right, 153. The church father Jerome said, quote, there are 153 different types of fish in the Sea of Galilee, and they caught one of each, end quote. Now, a more modern commentator, William Barclay, agrees with that, and he suggests that one of each variety represents God's redemption of all the nations and the peoples through Christ. Kind of a living parable of the parable of the dragnet, where you cast it out in the sea and takes one of all the nations and kinds. Gregory the Great said, 10 is for the commandments, 7 is the perfect number, 10 plus 7 equals 17. The Trinity makes salvation possible, and 17 times 3 is 51. Multiply 51 times 3, and it equals 153. Well, why multiply it by 3? I think that's because it's the only way you get 153. So I don't know. Maybe it's just this. That's how many they caught. You ever know a fisherman who didn't count his fish that he caught? But here's the point of that. The Lord is extremely generous. Extremely generous. You know, he could have counted heads. How many of my disciples are out there? Okay. And he could have just had them catch one fish for each person. Hey, bring your fish up here, put them with mine, we'll have some breakfast. But that's not the way he does things. As we saw in the story in John chapter 2, when he gives in abundance. It's amazing grace, how sweet the sound saved a wretch like me. The upshot of this is that they are excited again. I want to give you, in the very few minutes that we have left, I want to give you three applications, 3 things to take home from this little story. Christ supplies, and I think one of the things that he's going to supply to the apostles on this occasion and to us is some perspective and balance. So I want you to track with me for just a few more minutes, and let's see if we can't make some eminently practical applications from this story. Let me give you 3 things, and the lesson to be yours. Here they are. Number 1, emotions fluctuate. We need to be realistic about that. Fluctuating emotions are natural. We need to be realistic about that. Have you ever thought about the kind of roller coaster ride that the disciples, that the apostles have been on in the last month or so? I mean, think about this. They had gone from the triumphal entry into Jerusalem to their desertion of him in Gethsemane. They had gone from despair at the foot of the cross to the excitement of resurrection and his appearance to them on resurrection evening. They had gone from their restlessness by the Sea of Galilee to the excitement and the enthusiasm of his presence, both in the fish that he provided for them, but also just the presence of Jesus there. And so they were up and down. It was just a roller coaster of emotions, one after another for these men. And the point of that is, and maybe what we need to learn there is that it's natural for levels of enthusiasm to change. I mean, enthusiasm fluctuates. We need to be honest and realistic about that. It's natural for levels of enthusiasm to change. You should not, ladies and gentlemen, you should not feel guilty if you're not always on a high about your job, or even about your marriage, or even your Christian life. You say, well, Don, I don't know about that. You know what? I've had Christians say to me, man, Don, I just wish I could be as excited about my Christian life as the day I was baptized. I'm not sure you can. Now, maybe you can. Let me just speak for myself about that. But it seems to me that there are some experiences that cannot be duplicated, that they are point-in-time events. And while we have memory of them, and they are special to us, and they evoke powerful emotional responses and memories for us, I'm not sure we can go back in time to that point in history and feel exactly the way. Now, the good news is that they are not the standard by which our spirituality or our faithfulness are measured. I thought about that. I guess it was week before last. You know, with live sports being on hiatus now, ESPN and other networks they've been showing some replays of some of the most iconic games in baseball, basketball, hockey, football. And week before last, ESPN showed Game 1 of the 1988 World Series. Now, the 1988 World Series was played between the Los Angeles Dodgers. Now, I'm a Los Angeles Dodgers fan. I grew up in Southern California. I just always, all my life, I've been a Los Angeles Dodgers fan, and still am to this day. And the 1988 World Series was between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the evil empire known as the New York Yankees. And ESPN, week before last, showed Game 1 of the World Series. And in Game 1 of the World Series, in the ninth inning, the Dodgers were behind by a run. It was 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth. The most powerful and efficient and effective closer was pitching for the Yankees, Dennis Eckersley. And the Dodgers brought up to pinch hit Kirk Gibson. Now, he was a star for the Dodgers, but he was injured that night. He hadn't played all night. He could barely walk, but he walked his way to the batter's box. And if you're a Dodgers fan, you know this scene. With 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth and 2 strikes, he hits a 2-run walk-off home run to win the game. And that catapulted the Dodgers to the series. They won the World Series that year 4-1. But every Los Angeles Dodgers fan remembers that iconic image of him hitting the home run and rounding the bases and the celebration at the plate. I remember watching that live in 1988. And when I watched it week before last, I was excited because I knew what was going to happen. I was listening to Vin Scully, the Los Angeles Dodgers, announce all of that, and it brought very, very good memories to me. But I tell you what, it didn't bring the same exact feeling as it did so many years ago. You can't replicate that. And the point of that is that there are some feelings and emotions that can't be duplicated. And so you can remember them and cherish them. But even with something like our baptism, while we remember that and cherish that, that really is just the beginning point, isn't it? And so we got to rise to walk, to make progress one step at a time, to move forward, to make progress, to experience new experiences in the Christian life. Enthusiasm fluctuates. We need to be realistic about that. Secondly, priorities matter. We got to be obedient. Priorities matter. We must be obedient. I tell you, to their credit, the disciples continued to function even when they were frustrated and discouraged. They did what they were supposed to do. Jesus said, go to Galilee. They got up, they walked 70 miles to Galilee, and they stayed there. They stayed there until Jesus appeared. You've got to appreciate that about them. Galatians 6 and beginning in verse 9. Let us not grow weary while we are doing good, because in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. You know, ladies and gentlemen, when the excitement, when the glamour is gone, and the routine of whatever it may be has become the norm, that's really the test of our character, isn't it? How do we handle things when the new has become routine and that's now the norm? How do we handle things when the excitement of the first day of a school semester is over? How do we handle things when the first day of a new job is long in the past? How do we handle things when the honeymoon in our marriage is over? How do you handle things when your initial obedience to God in baptism is now years in the rearview mirror? How do you handle things then? Well, priorities matter. We got to be obedient in those things. And you got to stay with it if you're a student during that semester. You got to continue to be an employee that fulfills what Paul said in the book of Ephesians, that you remember you're working on the job, whether it's your first day or you're 20 or 25 or 30 years into this. You work as though you're working for Jesus Christ. In your marriage, faithfulness, fidelity is what God expects over the long haul, decade after decade after decade. And your obedience to God, exactly He expects. Obedience. You know what we have to remember, ladies and gentlemen? We've got to remember that beneath the new that inevitably wears off, there's meaning. Beneath the new that one day will wear off, the bright, shiny newness and excitement of things, there's meaning. And that meaning has value. I think about things like my college diploma. My college diploma is, it's at my house, somewhere at my house. It is put away somewhere, but it's not thrown away. I put it away, but I didn't throw it away. Well, why? Well, because it has meaning to me. It has meaning to me. Now, it's years and years and years in the past, but it represents something in my life, and so it has meaning to me. And so while it may be out of sight, it still has meaning to me. Or I think about my wedding ring here, my wedding ring. My wedding ring, it doesn't look exactly like it did when it was brand new. Now, I can't get it off. It would be impossible to take it off. But it doesn't look exactly like it did. At one point in time, it had ridges in the gold, and there's a silver on either side of it in a band, and it had some etching in there that was very, very clear. But all that's gone now because it's 43 years old. It's 43 years old. And so it doesn't look exactly like it once did, but you can't have it. You can't have it. And you can't buy it from me. Well, why not? Well, because it has meaning. Well, but Don, it doesn't look like it always is. Well, that's true. It's old, Don. Well, that's right. So am I. But you can't have my wedding ring. Or I think about my baptism. My baptism was 48 years in the past. My baptism was 2,496 Sundays in the past. My baptism is 2,496 Sundays in the past. But I will tell you, my baptism is still important to me. I remember that Sunday morning. I was 14 years old on a beautiful sunny Sunday morning in Kennett, Missouri. I remember during the invitation song, prying my fingers off the back of the pew in front of me. I remember walking down the aisle. My dad, the preacher, my dad was down at the head of the aisle. I remember going back to prepare for the baptism. I remember the gentleman, the man who went back to help me change. I remember his name. I remember the things that he said to me as I prepared to be baptized. I remember going down to the baptistry and the expression on my dad's face as he baptized me that day. And all of that is 48 years in the past. What's the point of that? The point of it is that those things have meaning to me, value to me. Now, I can't live off the fumes of that because all of us who are baptized into Christ, we had again to rise, to walk. How do you define walk? It means to proceed one step at a time. And so we had to make progress. But that point in time was extremely important. But whether your baptism is 5 days in the past or 50 years in the past, Your priorities have to be obedience to God. We got to be faithful and obedient, even when we're not as excited about something as we used to be. We got to maintain our level of intensity about faith that demonstrates to ourselves and especially to our family, especially our kids and our grandkids, what our priorities are. And so again, let's not grow weary while doing good, because in due season we will reap if we don't lose heart. All of Christianity is not a mountaintop experience. Wish it was. It'd be nice if it was all like Moses on Sinai, Elijah on Carmel, or Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. But it's not. It's not all a mountaintop experience. There are valleys that you've got to traverse. Sometimes they're spiritual valleys, relational valleys, financial valleys, personal valleys that have to be crossed. And it's then that Satan slides up next to us and he says things like this: your God must not care much for you, because if he cared for you, you wouldn't be going through this valley. That's a lie. God's love for us is unchanging. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation, no shadow of changing. And if we don't believe that lie, Satan will say, you know what? The problem is you're just not cut out to be a Christian. I know you're trying, but clearly, if you're not as excited about your faith as you once were, then that means that you're just not cut out to be a Christian. You may as well go ahead and give up. Those are both lies. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the old saying, we're not called to always be happy. We are called to always be holy. And then third and finally, just a couple of minutes left, and so let's finish with this. Application number 3, Christ will appear. And so we've got to be prepared. Christ will appear. We've got to be prepared. Now, the disciples didn't know when he was going to appear. They just knew that he promised that he would. And they believed that promise. And so they waited. We don't know how long they waited, but however long it was, there they were. They were obedient, and they waited, and they were prepared. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen? He's promised us too. And so we too need to be prepared. Now, I want to just leave this very, very quickly before we end this evening. So track with me, please, for just a couple of minutes here, because I think this is extremely important. All of this narrative, it seems to me to this point, down to verse 14, all of this narrative, it seems to me, is designed to get Jesus to a conversation that he wants to have with the Apostle Peter. And in that conversation, Jesus basically is going to make 3 points to the Apostle Peter. And I think that they are 3 points that he makes to the Apostle Peter, and that he's making, by extension, to you and me. And by extension, he's saying, look, Don, to all of us, you've got to realize these 3 things in order to be prepared for when the silence of heaven is broken and Christ appears again and we give an account of ourselves to him. It seems to me that everything in this narrative leads to Jesus saying 3 things to the Apostle Peter, and by extension then to us in 21st century America as Christians, so that when the silence of heaven is broken and we give an account of ourselves to Jesus, we can do so acceptably. And so here are the 3 things. 3 things that Jesus said to Peter, and by extension to us. He said, first of all, Peter, you got to face your past before you can embrace your future. And so before Jesus talks to Peter about his future, which he will, first he makes him look through that big picture window of his life back at the darkest hour of his life. You've got to know Peter didn't want to do that. You have to know that he was hoping and praying that Jesus wouldn't bring up the past. But bring it up he does, because he's got to deal with that. And so the issue of Peter's denial of Jesus, by extension, clearly he brings that up to him. Do you love me? You denied me. Do you love me? Do you love me? You denied me a second time. Do you love me? You denied me 3 times. Do you love me? And he's making Peter deal with his past before he will allow Peter to embrace the future. Just like with us, ladies and gentlemen. Just like with us. Facing and dealing with our past can be an extraordinarily painful thing. But until we do that, until we practice what the Bible calls confession, acknowledging to say with, confess, to say with, until we acknowledge what God already knows, and until we then, second Bible word, repent of that, we can't embrace our future. And then secondly, with Peter, he says, you need to discover, Peter, you've got to discover your purpose and then fulfill that with passion. Now, the purpose that Jesus gave Peter was, I want you to feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And so the purpose for the Apostle Peter, and again, by extension for us, is that we've got to look beyond ourselves. We've got to focus on others. Now, we may not be a shepherd in the exact same way that Peter was. But I will tell you that most all of you who are watching tonight, you probably have a flock that you shepherd. Because if you have a family, you have a flock. If you teach a Bible class, you have a flock. If you teach a class in a schoolroom at school, you have a flock. If you work a job and you have influence among your peers, you have a flock. If you go to school and you have influence among your classmates, you have a flock. Most all of us have multiple flocks. And Jesus said, as was spoken by the Apostle Paul in Philippians 2, do nothing through selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. We have to discover that purpose. And then we got to fulfill that with passion. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this life isn't all about us. It's not all about you. It's not all about me. It's about finding a way to make a difference for good in the life of others. And then thirdly, Jesus said, Peter, you got to look at yourself first. He said, Peter, I want you to learn to look at a mirror, not through binoculars. That's good counsel for all of us, by the way. And so Jesus says to Peter, okay, I want you to feed my sheep, feed my lambs. But he says, Peter, I need to tell you one other thing. When you were a young man, you charted your own course, you went your own way. But when you're old, somebody else is going to bind you. You're going to die a martyr's death. And you know the narrative because you're good Bible students. Peter looks at the disciple whom Jesus loved. We assume he's looking at John. And he looks at John and he thinks about what Jesus just told him. And he says, well, Jesus, okay, fine. What about him? What about him? What about John? And Jesus says, hey, Peter, I tell you what. Put the binoculars away and pull out a mirror and look at yourself first. Don't look at John. Look at yourself. And I tell you, I believe that this story builds to this point so that Jesus can say, look, I'm going to appear again. I'm going to appear again. And you're going to have to give an account of yourself in these three areas. What did you do with your past sins? And did you make a difference for good in the life of others? And have you looked at yourself honestly? Or have you been so busy focusing on others that you've not examined yourself, whether you're in the faith or not, and proved your own self, as Paul said to the Corinthians? Well, you know, part of the challenge with knowing that the Lord is going to come again is that we just don't know when, that day and hour. No one knows, not even the angels in heaven and the Son, but the Father. And so Jesus said, look, be on your guard, be alert. You don't know when that time will come. It's like a man going away, and he leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task. And he tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you don't know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. And if he comes suddenly, don't let him find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. That's wonderful counsel, isn't it? Wonderful counsel. So here's the application of that. He's coming again. He's coming again. We know that. The angel said to the apostles who had just watched Jesus ascend to heaven, the angel said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here gazing up into heaven? The same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come again in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." But the challenge again is we don't know when. We are a week from hurricane season in Florida. When you watch these videos, it will be hurricane season. It will be the first week of June. And in Florida, you know, we have hurricane tracking charts. We have those charts that you can plot. You can chart the progression of a hurricane. But we don't have a, as it were, a hurricane tracking chart for the second coming of Jesus. We just don't know when that's going to be. And so we have to always be prepared. And that's the point. We just have to be prepared. I lived in Houston, Texas for several years. And in Houston, as on this side of the Gulf, in Tampa Bay, hurricanes would in fact come into the Gulf. When I lived in Houston, there was a massive hurricane. It was Hurricane Gilbert. Hurricane Gilbert, by the time that it got up in the Gulf of Mexico, encompassed the entire Gulf. And it was coming directly. It was coming directly for the Texas coastline. And in particular, the Texas coastline where I lived in Houston down to Galveston Bay. And as it came toward Texas, there was a judge in Brazoria County, which was just south of Houston where I lived, who said these words. When evacuation orders were given, the judge in Brazoria County said, "If you refuse to evacuate, please leave us your fingerprints so we can identify your remains and notify your next of kin." In other words, the hurricane's coming. Now, with a hurricane, you know that's kind of a beach ball in the wind. You may not know exactly where it's going to land and exactly when it's going to get there. But you do know that you need to be prepared for whatever it brings. And we too, ladies and gentlemen, have been warned. And we can either escape danger by being prepared, or we can suffer the consequences of our refusal. But either way, the choice is entirely ours. Well, thank you for listening so very, very well over these 4 days. Thank you for opening your Bible and studying with us. And thank you to the Valrico Shepherds for asking me to talk about such wonderful stories out of the life of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Now I really do pray that what we have studied has been beneficial. We've tried to make these lessons as practical as we possibly can. And I pray that they've been helpful to you in some way. You're a wonderful church family. I'm honored to know you, honored to have a part in speaking with you from time to time. Appreciate you so very, very much. And I hope and pray that our paths will cross again soon. God bless you tonight and always. Thank you.